The day Minnie Winslow rode into Caldwell, Kansas with nothing but a carpet bag, a stubborn mare named Clover, and a letter promising honest work, she had no way of knowing that the hardest fight of her life was waiting for her at the gates of the Double T Ranch, and that the most unexpected thing about that fight would not be losing it, but the man who watched her refuse to. The year was 1882, and the Kansas plains were still raw country, the kind that chewed up soft people and spit them out before the first frost. Caldwell sat right along the Kisham Trail, a town that smelled of cattle dust and ambition, where saloons outnumbered churches 3-1, and the wind never quite stopped howling through the gaps between the wooden storefronts. Minnie had come from Wichita, where she had spent 3 years keeping books for a dry goods merchant who paid her half what the position was worth because she was a woman, and he believed that was fair. She had argued with him too, as it turned out. Arguing seemed to be something she could not help, the way some people could not help humming while they worked or tapping their fingers on a table. It was simply the way she was made. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under a flat-brimmed hat, green eyes that people often described as sharp, and hands that were already calloused from years of work that had nothing delicate about it. She was not small and she was not fragile, and she had learned long ago that waiting for someone to treat her fairly was a fool's errand. You had to demand fair treatment, or you would never see it. The letter in her carpet bag had come from a ranch hand she had known years ago, a man named Pete Calloway, who had worked briefly for the dry goods merchant before heading south. Pete had written to say that the Double T Ranch outside Caldwell was looking for someone who could keep accounts, manage supply orders, and handle the books that the previous man had left in a tangle before disappearing with 3 months of payroll. Pete had said the ranch owner, a man named Grant Turner, was known to be fair, known to pay honest wages, and known to run a large operation that could actually use someone competent. Pete had also said, almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the letter, that the foreman was a man named Dale Hutchins, and that she ought to be careful around him, though Pete had not explained why. She had arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early October, when the sky was that particular shade of pale blue that only appeared in the west, wide and enormous and utterly indifferent to human trouble. The Double T was a proper spread. She could see that immediately. The main house was a 2-story frame building with a covered porch, white painted and solid, the kind of house that took years to build up to. Beyond it stretched the bunkhouse, the stables, a large barn, a separate cookhouse, and the long flat expanse of the cattle pens. There were hands moving everywhere, working with the efficient quiet of men who knew their business. A man came out to meet her before she had fully dismounted. He was broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his middle 30s, with a wide flat face and small eyes that moved over her in a way that made her want to button her coat higher. He had a foreman's bearing, the kind of authority that sat on a man like a second skin, and she knew before he opened his mouth that this was Dale Hutchins. "You the bookkeeper Turner sent for?" Hutchins asked. "Minnie Winslow," she said, stepping down from Clover and holding out her hand. "I am." He looked at her hand for a moment before shaking it, brief and reluctant. "Didn't know you were a woman." "Most women are," she said pleasantly. His expression tightened. "Ranch work is no place for a woman." "Bookkeeping isn't ranch work," she pointed out. "It's ledger work and I'm very good at it." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Turner's not here until tomorrow. You can sleep in the house tonight, but I'll be putting your work off until he says you stay." Something in the way he said it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Not until he says you stay. Until he says whether you stay." There was a difference there, a small, deliberate one, and Minnie filed it away with the same precision she applied to columns of numbers. She was settled into a small room on the upper floor of the main house, a clean spare room with a window overlooking the pens. She washed the trail dust off herself, changed into a fresh shirtwaist, and came down to supper with the ranch cook, a stout woman named Ruth who had been feeding the Double T's hands for 7 years, and who looked at Minnie with the frank assessment of someone who had seen plenty come and go. "Hutchins give you trouble already?" Ruth asked, setting a bowl of stew in front of her. "He expressed reservations," Minnie said. Ruth snorted. "That's one word for it. He expressed reservations at the last bookkeeper too, and the one before." Neither of those men were any good, but Hutchins still made their lives miserable. "Man thinks he runs this ranch and ought to have a say in everything." "Does he?" Minnie asked. "Run it, I mean, with Mr. Turner away. Turner's been gone 3 weeks dealing with a cattle dispute up near Dodge City. Hutchins has had this place to himself, and he has enjoyed it considerably too much." Ruth paused, looked at Minnie with something that was almost a warning. "You watch yourself. He doesn't like people who ask questions." "I ask a great many questions," Minnie said. "I know," Ruth said. "I can tell." She spent the next morning doing what she always did when she arrived somewhere new. She looked at everything. She walked the property with the quiet observation of someone cataloging data, noted the condition of the fencing along the south pasture, the stack of supply invoices that had been left in a loose pile on the desk in the small office off the main room, the feed records that were 3 weeks out of date, and the fact that the tally for the current herd in the south field did not match the tally posted on the board in the barn. The discrepancy was small enough that a less careful eye might have missed it. Minnie did not miss things. She had been at the desk for perhaps 2 hours, carefully sorting the invoices into date order and building a rough picture of the accounts, when Hutchins came in without knocking. "What are you doing?" he said. "Sorting the invoices," she said, not looking up. "They have not been filed in sequence, and some of the amounts don't reconcile with the delivery records. Those aren't your concern until Turner says you stay. If I find a discrepancy before Mr. Turner arrives, that will be useful information for him," she said evenly. "If you would like me to stop, you are welcome to tell him you asked me to." The silence that followed was not a comfortable one. She could feel him looking at her, and she kept her eyes on the papers because looking up would be an invitation to a fight she wasn't ready for yet. She needed to understand the numbers first. "Those records are fine," he said at last. "The last man handled them." "The last man left 3 months of payroll unaccounted for," she said. "I'm not judging his work, I'm just reviewing what's here. I said those records are fine." She set down her pen and looked up at him then, because some things required direct eye contact. "Mr. Hutchins, I have been hired to audit these accounts. That is what I am doing. If there is something in these records you would prefer I not see, I suggest you tell Mr. Turner that when he arrives rather than me." His face had gone a particular shade of red that she recognized as dangerous. She kept her voice calm, her hands still, and her gaze steady. He was a man who was used to people backing down. She had no intention of backing down. "You have a smart mouth," he said. "I have a precise one," she said. "There is a difference." He left. She kept working. The discrepancy she had noticed in the cattle tally grew as she dug deeper into the records. By midday she had found 4 separate purchase orders for feed and supplies that had been recorded as paid, but for which there were no corresponding delivery receipts. The amounts were not enormous, but together they added up to something meaningful, and the pattern of them, all filed during the 3 weeks when Turner had been absent, made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She was still at the desk at 2 in the afternoon, with a carefully drafted summary of her findings laid out in front of her, when she heard the sound of horses coming into the yard. She looked through the window and saw a group of riders, 3 of them, moving at a steady pace toward the main house. The one in the lead sat a horse the way only certain men do, with the unconscious ease of someone who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. He was wearing a dark coat and a hat that had seen considerable use, and he was not the kind of man you missed in a landscape. She heard the door open downstairs, heard Hutchins's voice carrying from the yard, and then she heard his tone shift, not to deference exactly, but to a kind of careful calibration, the tone of a man who knows that someone outranks him and is deciding how much of himself to show. Grant Turner had come home. She gathered her papers and came down the stairs. She heard Hutchins before she reached the bottom step. His voice had that particular carrying quality of a man who believes he is making his case and winning it. He had Turner backed up against the doorframe of the front room, not physically, but conversationally, the way a confident man crowds a space with his words. "The woman's been in your office all morning going through the files," Hutchins was saying. "I told her it wasn't her place until you'd confirmed the arrangement, but she went ahead anyway. She's got a manner about her that I don't think is suited to a working ranch." Minnie came off the last step and into the room, her papers in her hands, and both men looked at her. Grant Turner was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with dark hair that was dusty from the trail, and a face that was all clean angles and steady brown eyes that landed on her with the kind of attention that made a person feel genuinely seen. He was not performing authority the way Hutchins was. He simply had it quietly, the way a good piece of land simply has water under it. It was there whether you dug for it or not. He looked at her, then at the papers in her hands, then back at her face. "You must be Miss Winslow," he said. "I am," she said. "And I need to speak with you about these accounts." Hutchins moved to insert himself back into the center of the room. "Turner, I was telling you—" "You were," Turner said, not unkindly but with a finality that stopped Hutchins where he stood. Then he looked at Minnie again, and there was something in his expression, not amusement exactly, but something close to it, a recognition of something he had not anticipated. "Whose side are you on, Miss Winslow?" The question was casual, almost offhand. The kind of thing a man says when he walks into a room and finds two people mid-dispute and is trying to take the temperature of things quickly. But she heard the weight underneath it, the real question. Are you going to be trouble or are you going to be useful? She met his eyes without wavering. "My own," she said. The silence that followed was maybe 3 seconds long and felt considerably longer. Then Grant Turner did something she had not anticipated. He smiled. Not broadly, not the performative grin of a man trying to charm his way through a situation, but a small, genuine smile that started at the corner of his mouth and reached his eyes, and it changed the whole geometry of his face in a way that made her breath catch for just a second before she got it back under control. "Well," he said, "that's an honest answer." He looked at Hutchins. "Dale, I'll hear Miss Winslow out about the accounts. We can talk later." Hutchins's jaw set in a way that said the conversation was far from over, but he left. Turner turned back to her. "Tell me what you found." She sat down at the table in the front room and spread her papers out and told him. She was precise and methodical, the way she always was when the numbers were doing her talking for her, and she watched his face as she walked him through the discrepancies. The unmatched purchase orders, the feed invoices with no deliveries attached, the cattle tally that did not reconcile with the purchase records from 6 weeks ago. She did not accuse Hutchins by name. She simply laid out what the records showed and let him draw his own conclusions. He was quiet for a long moment when she finished. "How long would it take you to make a full accounting?" he asked. "A week if you leave me to it," she said. "Maybe less if the delivery records in the barn are complete." "They are," he said. "Ruth keeps them." He paused, looked at the papers again. "You did this in one morning." "I am good at my work," she said simply. He looked up at her then, and the brown eyes were steady and direct. "I can see that." He sat back. "You're hired, Miss Winslow. Full rate, same as a man doing this work would receive. I don't pay people different for the same job." She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it purely, without the habitual caution she usually wrapped around gratitude. "You should also know," he said, and his voice dropped a little, not conspiratorially but carefully, "that what you found here is going to make some unpleasant things necessary. Hutchins has been with this ranch for 4 years. If what these numbers suggest is true, that's a serious matter." "I know," she said. "Are you prepared for him to be angry with you?" She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Turner, I have been prepared for men to be angry with me for most of my adult life." It doesn't change what the numbers say. He held her gaze for another moment, and there it was again, that flicker of something in his expression that she could not quite name, something between respect and a kind of curious wondering. Then he stood and put his hat back on. "I'll go talk to Dale. You'll have full access to everything you need." She watched him go and then sat very still for a moment in the empty room, listening to the sounds of the ranch outside the window, the creak of the weather vane on the barn, the distant lowing of cattle, the boot steps of the hands crossing the yard. She was aware of something she had not expected to feel in quite this way. She felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She pushed the thought aside and went back to work. The next week was the hardest kind of busy. Minnie worked from early light until after supper most days, building the full accounting that would tell the real story of the Double T's finances. Ruth brought her coffee and the occasional piece of corn bread without being asked, which Minnie understood was Ruth's version of solidarity. The barn's delivery records were indeed complete, kept in Ruth's small, precise handwriting in a ledger that had a different quality to it than the financial books. It was the record of a woman who noticed when things were missing and wrote them down, not because anyone asked her to, but because she believed that the truth of a place lived in its details. What the records together told was not a pleasant story. Over the course of approximately 8 weeks, someone had been purchasing supplies through the ranch's accounts, recording the purchases as delivered and paid, and then either reselling the supplies or diverting them somewhere else. The total amount was not small. It was, in fact, enough to make a significant difference to the ranch's quarterly position. On the 4th day of her audit, Hutchins came to the office door and looked at her. "You're making yourself unpopular," he said. "I'm doing my job," she said. "Turner trusted me for 4 years." She set down her pen and looked at him carefully. His face was different now from the first day. The aggression was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that looked almost like desperation. She thought about what it must feel like to watch someone methodically dismantle the thing you had built for yourself, the freedom you had carved out of another man's absence. "Then you should have kept faith with that trust," she said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply honest. He left without another word. She brought the completed audit to Grant Turner on the 7th day. She had laid it out clearly, organized into sections, with a summary at the front that gave the plain numbers and then a detailed breakdown behind it. She had been careful to document only what the records showed and not what she believed, because beliefs were not admissible evidence, and she knew the difference. He read it in silence while she sat across from him. The evening light was coming in through the windows at a low angle, gold and amber, the kind of light that made the plains look like they had been painted rather than simply grown up from the earth. She watched his face as he read, saw the set of his jaw change as the numbers built toward their conclusion. When he was done, he set the papers down and was quiet for a long moment. "It's Dale," he said finally. It was not a question. The pattern of dates and the purchasing authority used both point to the foreman's oversight period, she said carefully. "I can't tell you definitively who made the choices. I can tell you who had the access and the opportunity." That's careful language. "It's accurate language," he looked at her. "What do you think?" She met his eyes. "I think you already know what I think, but what I think doesn't belong in an accounting report." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, not with the numbers in front of him, but something close to it. He rubbed his hand across his jaw, and she heard the rasp of it in the quiet room. "I built this ranch up from 80 head of cattle and a bad piece of land my father left me," he said, and there was something raw in his voice that he did not try to hide. "I've been gone 3 weeks, and this is what I come back to." She did not offer him false comfort. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the direct, ungarnished way she meant most things. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt the weight of it in a way that was different from how she usually experienced being looked at by men. Most men looked at her as a challenge or an obstacle or occasionally a curiosity. He looked at her as if he was seeing someone he recognized, someone whose existence made a kind of sense to him. "You've been here a week," he said. "8 days," she said. "You've done more honest work in 8 days than the last 2 men combined did in 8 months." He paused. "I want you to stay on, permanently if that suits you. I need someone I can trust with these books, and I'd like it to be you." The permanence of the words settled around her like something she had not realized she had been cold without. She looked at him and said, "It suits me." He confronted Hutchins that evening. Minnie did not witness it directly, but she heard it from across the yard where she was walking Clover, the raised voices from the direction of the barn, Turner's steady and controlled and Hutchins's increasingly frantic. Ruth came to stand beside her on the path. "It's done then," Ruth said quietly. "The accounting is done," Minnie said. "What comes next is his to decide." "He'll let him go," Ruth said. "Turner's a fair man, but he's not a forgiving one when the trust is gone. Once it's gone with him, that's the end of it." As it turned out, Ruth was right. Hutchins left the Double T the following morning. He loaded his horse in cold silence, and when he rode past where Minnie was standing in the yard, he looked at her with a flat, contained anger that said everything and said nothing. She held his gaze until he looked away, and then she turned back to the barn and did not watch him go. The ranch needed a new foreman, and the weeks that followed were a reorganization of everything: the accounts, the supply chains, the staffing, the cattle management that had been allowed to drift during the period when Hutchins had been running things to suit his own interests. Grant Turner was present for all of it, working from before sunrise until well after dark, and Minnie found herself working alongside him in a way that was practical and purposeful, and that she told herself was simply professional. It was Ruth who pointed out, without any particular subtlety, that Minnie had started keeping her office door open after Turner began stopping by in the evenings to review the day's numbers. "You kept it shut the whole first week," Ruth said one morning with perfect innocence. "It was colder then," Minnie said. Ruth said nothing further, but the look on her face said considerably more. The truth was that Minnie was paying attention to Grant Turner in a way that made her uncomfortable, because she was not in the habit of paying that kind of attention to anyone, and she had a healthy suspicion of her own instincts where men were concerned. She had watched enough women she respected make choices based on feelings that turned out to be smoke, and she had no interest in making those choices herself. But there was something about the way he treated her that was different from anything she had experienced in a working relationship, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in the weather before you can name exactly what has shifted. He consulted her. Not in the performative way of a man who is asking a question he has already answered for himself, but genuinely, with the kind of real curiosity about her opinion that suggested he expected her answer to change what he did. He would come into the office with a problem, something about a supplier who was overcharging, or a question about whether it made financial sense to expand the south pasture, and he would lay it out and then actually wait for her response. And when she gave it, he listened without the slight glaze that came over men's eyes when they were waiting for her to finish speaking so they could say what they had already decided. One evening in mid-October, about 3 weeks after her arrival, they were both at the table in the front room with the ranch's supply contracts spread between them when the lamp on the table guttered in a draft and nearly went out. They both reached to steady it at the same moment, and his hand landed over hers on the base of the lamp, warm and direct, and neither of them moved for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She looked up and found his eyes already on her face. She removed her hand carefully. "The contracts," she said. "Yes," he said, and looked back at the papers. But something had shifted between them, small and definite, like the first crack in ice that tells you the thaw has started. She thought about it later that night, lying in the small room upstairs with the Kansas wind moving against the window glass. She thought about what she knew of Grant Turner from 8 days' worth of careful observation, that he was fair, not as a performance but as a genuine operating principle, that he worked harder than any of his hands and did not make a point of it, that Ruth, who had no patience for pretense, regarded him with genuine affection. That when he talked about the ranch, about the land, there was a feeling in his voice that she recognized because it was the same feeling she had about numbers, that particular passion for a thing you had built with your own hands and your own intelligence. She also thought about the practical reality of her situation. She was a woman working on a ranch in Kansas in 1882, in a position that most people she had grown up around would have considered either impossible or scandalous. She had no family nearby, no real safety net, and the one thing she could depend on absolutely was the quality of her own work. Complicating that with feelings for the man who employed her was the kind of thing she would normally have set aside firmly and efficiently, the way she set aside numbers that didn't belong in a particular column. But she lay awake for a while before she slept, and the weight of his hand over hers was still warm in her memory. The new foreman arrived in early November. His name was Thomas Briggs, a sun-weathered man of 40 who had come up from Texas with references that Minnie verified with the same thoroughness she applied to everything else. He was competent and quiet, and had the particular quality of a man who had been around long enough to know what he didn't know, which made him considerably easier to work with than his predecessor had been. With a reliable foreman in place and the accounts sorted into order, the ranch began to find its rhythm again. Minnie had settled into the work in a way that felt permanent, not just in the contractual sense, but in the deeper sense of a person who has found the place where their particular skills are genuinely needed. She reorganized the record-keeping system, brought the supply contracts to more favorable terms by identifying 3 suppliers who had been overcharging by small amounts that added up to a significant sum over the course of a year, and worked with Ruth to create a proper inventory system for the cookhouse that reduced waste and saved money on a quarterly basis. Grant noticed all of it. She was aware of that, not in a self-congratulatory way, but in the practical sense of understanding that her position was secure because her work made it secure, which was the only kind of security she trusted. What she was less prepared for was the other thing she noticed in him, the small, particular attentions that were not about the work. The way he made sure her horse was stabled near the warmest part of the barn as the October nights grew cold. The way he had Ruth set a place for her at the family table in the main house rather than with the hands, which was a statement of a kind, though he made it without announcement. The way he sometimes paused in the doorway of the office when he passed, not entering, just pausing, as if the sight of her at work was something he wanted to look at for a moment before he moved on. She told herself these things were the natural courtesies of a fair employer. She was aware, with the part of her that was honest even when honesty was inconvenient, that she was not entirely convincing herself. The real turning point came on a Sunday afternoon in late November, when the work was quiet, and the temperature had dropped enough that the sky looked white and close. That particular Kansas sky that meant snow was thinking about arriving. Minnie had spent the morning writing letters to 2 of the ranch's creditors about adjusted payment schedules, and in the afternoon she put on her coat and walked out toward the south pasture, because she needed to move and think in the way that required open sky. She found Grant Turner leaning on the fence at the south pasture's edge, looking out at the cattle. She almost turned back, because the afternoon felt private in a way that made her reluctant to intrude. But he heard her step and turned, and there was no pretending she was somewhere else. "Miss Winslow," he said. "Mr. Turner," she said. She came to stand beside him at the fence, a proper distance between them, looking out at the cattle moving slowly across the pale November grass. They stood in silence for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence which surprised her. Most silences with men felt like they were waiting for something, loaded with expectation or discomfort. This one simply was. "My father ran 300 head on this land," Turner said finally. "When he left it to me, there were 42. He'd had a bad run of it the last 3 years, drought and then a cattle disease, and then the market dropped." He paused. "I was 23. I didn't know what I was doing." She looked at him. The profile of his face was clean against the white sky, serious and unself-conscious. "How long did it take?" she asked. "5 years to get back to where he'd been," he said. "2 more to get past it." He looked at her. 7 years is a long time to do one thing. "What kept you going?" she asked, and the question was genuine, not conversational. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "The land," he said at last. "I know that sounds simple, but there's something about land you've worked. It knows you back in a way, or you start to think it does." He paused. "And I think I needed to prove something. I'm not sure I've entirely worked out who I needed to prove it to." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said. He turned to look at her, and the directness of it was a little startling. "Tell me something about yourself," he said. "You know everything about my ranch, and I know almost nothing about you." She considered this. She was not in the habit of telling people things about herself, having found that information was a form of exposure and that most people used it carelessly. But there was something in the quality of his attention that made her think he would not use it carelessly. "I grew up in Missouri," she said. "My father was a school teacher. My mother died when I was 12, and I took over most of the household work while he taught. He taught me the same things he taught his students, mathematics and reading and history, but he also taught me bookkeeping because he said a woman who could not manage money was a woman who would always be dependent on a man who managed it for her." She paused. "He was ahead of his time in some ways, and behind in others," Turner asked. "He expected me to marry at 18, she said. "A respectable local man. I had 3 offers. What happened? I looked at the accounts of all 3 households and decided that respectability and good management were not as closely linked as my father believed." He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and genuine, and she found herself smiling before she could decide whether to. "I went to Wichita," she said. "I found work. I built something for myself." She paused. "It was slower than I expected and harder than I was told it would be, but it worked." "And then you came here," he said. "And then I came here," she agreed. He was looking at her with that same steady attention that she had learned to recognize over the past weeks, the look that meant he was actually thinking about what she had said rather than waiting for her to finish. "Are you glad you did?" he asked, and there was something in the question that had a weight beyond the simple curiosity of it, a careful watching of her answer. She looked out at the cattle in the pale afternoon light, and she thought about the office that felt like hers now, the work that felt right in her hands, the sound of the ranch around her that she had begun to hear as a kind of music. "Yes," she said, simply and honestly. They stood together in the quiet until the wind came up and she pulled her coat tighter, and then they walked back toward the house side by side, not quite touching, the frozen grass crunching under their boots. Winter came down on the Kansas plains with its characteristic lack of apology. The first real snow arrived in December, a proper plains blizzard that shut the ranch in for 3 days and left everything white and still and enormous. The hands were occupied with the constant work of keeping the cattle alive in the cold, moving them to the sheltered pastures, breaking ice on the water troughs, bringing extra feed from the barn. The work did not pause for weather. It simply changed shape. Minnie found the confinement of the storm oddly pleasant, in the way that people who like their work find any excuse to do it undisturbed. She worked through the supply planning for the winter quarter, updated the cattle valuation records, and wrote out the first proper annual report the Double T had ever had. Ruth brought her soup and declared the annual report to be the fanciest piece of paperwork she had ever seen, which Minnie accepted as the highest compliment. On the second day of the blizzard, Turner came into the office in the evening with a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses, and she raised an eyebrow at him. "It's cold," he said by way of explanation. "It is," she agreed, and accepted the glass he poured. They sat on either side of the desk, which was covered in her usual careful arrangement of papers, and the lamp made a small warm circle in the winter dark outside the windows, and they talked. She could not have said later exactly what they talked about, because it was the kind of conversation that doesn't have a proper subject, that wanders from the price of beef to the nature of ambition to whether Kansas was better country than Missouri, stopping everywhere and going nowhere in particular. She told him about the 3 teachers she had admired and the 2 she had despised. He told her about the season he had spent working a cattle drive up the Kisham Trail at 21, and how it had changed the way he understood the land. She said something sharp about the condition of women's legal rights in 1882, and instead of deflecting he said, with a calm directness that surprised her, that he had always found it remarkable how much work was done by people who were not given credit for doing it, and that he thought the law was considerably behind the reality of what he saw around him every day. She set down her glass and looked at him. "That is not a position I expected from a Kansas rancher in 1882, she said. He looked at her steadily. "I had a mother who ran this household and half this ranch while my father was building the other half," he said. "She kept the accounts before I did. She kept everything. I watched her do it and I never thought anything was missing in her." He paused. "I don't think I ever thought of it as unusual until other people told me it was." She was quiet for a moment. "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. "She died 4 years ago," he said, and the simple flatness of it told her how much of the grief was still there. "I'm sorry," she said, and the word meant the same thing it had meant the first time she said it to him, in the fullest and most direct sense. They sat in the warm lamplight with the blizzard outside, and she was aware of the intimacy of it in a way that was not alarming but was very present, like the heat of a fire you have moved close to without quite deciding to move. "Minnie," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it, and the difference was considerable. "Grant," she said, quietly trying it. He looked at her across the desk with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen in him before. The careful reserve he usually wore had come down, not entirely, but enough. "I would like to take a walk with you," he said, "when the weather breaks, not for any particular purpose. Just to walk with you." She understood what he was saying. He was saying it carefully and clearly, without the elaborate machinery of courtship that most men used as a kind of cover, and she appreciated the honesty of it. "I think I would like that," she said. He smiled, and the warmth of it was simple and true, and she held it in her chest all the way upstairs to her room that night like something she was careful not to spill. The weather broke on the 3rd day, as it always does, the sun returning to the plains with the particular indifference of a place that neither apologizes for its excesses nor explains them. The world was white and quiet and enormous, the kind of beauty that only shows up when ordinary vision is temporarily impossible. They walked south along the fence line that afternoon, the snow crunching under their boots, Minnie in her heavy coat with her hat pulled down against the residual cold, Grant beside her with his hands in his coat pockets. They talked, as they always talked now, about everything and nothing, and she was aware of the pleasure of it in a way she had not been aware of a pleasure in a long time. At the point where the fence line turned east, he stopped and looked out at the expanse of white pasture, and she stopped beside him. "I want to tell you something," he said, not looking at her. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking about you in a way that is not entirely related to the quality of your bookkeeping," he said. It was said with a directness that was so characteristic of him that it made her heart squeeze. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The quality of my bookkeeping is quite high." He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was somewhere between exasperated and deeply fond, and she felt the fondness land in her chest like a warm stone. "It is," he agreed. "That is not what I meant." "I know what you meant," she said. She was looking at him directly, the way she always did, because she had never seen any advantage in looking away from things. "I have been thinking about you in a similar way." He was quiet for a moment. The plains stretched out around them, white and silent and endless under the December sky, the kind of silence that made everything you said feel important by virtue of being said into it at all. "I don't want to complicate your position here," he said carefully. "You've built something real with this work. I don't want anything I feel to put that at risk for you." She looked at him steadily. It was exactly the right thing to say, and she was moved by it in a way that she let herself feel without apology. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I am capable of determining what risks I take." "I know you are," he said. "I just wanted you to know I've thought about it." She was quiet for a moment longer, looking out at the white field. Then she said, "Grant." "Yes. Stop being so careful and say what you mean." He laughed, and it was the real laugh she had heard in November, the surprised one. And then he turned toward her and said, with a simplicity that undid every careful defense she had built, "Minnie Winslow, I think I am falling in love with you." The words sat in the cold December air between them, plain and clear. She looked at him. The wind moved his hair under his hat. The plains were enormous around them. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am falling in love with you too, and I want you to know that I do not say things like that casually." "I know," he said. "And I am not giving up the work," she said. "I would not ask you to," he said with a steadiness that she believed utterly. He reached out and took her hand. She was wearing gloves, and so was he, and the warmth of it came through the layers anyway, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and they stood like that for a while in the winter quiet, looking out at the white expanse of the land that he had built his life from, and she felt something settle around her that she did not have a word for except, perhaps, home. The courtship of Grant Turner and Minnie Winslow did not look like the courtship described in the ladies' periodicals that occasionally made their way to Caldwell. There were no formal calls with chaperones, no elaborate rituals of flowers and calling cards. There was instead the daily intimacy of shared work, the quiet evenings at the desk reviewing the accounts together, the conversations over supper that ranged across everything they both thought about, the long walks on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, moving across the land they were both, in different ways, committed to understanding. Ruth watched all of it with profound satisfaction, and the discretion of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the best thing you could do for two people who were finding each other was to make them tea and stay out of the way. Thomas Briggs, the new foreman, regarded the situation with the equanimity of a man who was focused on cattle and weather, and had no inclination to involve himself in anything that was not directly related to cattle and weather. The hands were aware of it in the way that people in close quarters are always aware of changes in the emotional weather. But they said nothing because they had collectively formed a favorable impression of Minnie over the months she had been at the Double T. An impression built partly on the fact that she had identified a discrepancy in the feed accounts that had been quietly shortchanging their pay packets, and partly on the fact that she was not condescending, treated them as the skilled workers they were, and never asked them to justify themselves to her in the way that some people from the management side of things occasionally did. January brought cold that bit differently than December cold, the kind that settled into the bones of the land and stayed. It brought also a visit from a cattle buyer from Kansas City named Morrison, a broad man with expensive boots who arrived with an offer for a portion of the spring herd. Grant negotiated with him in the main room while Minnie sat at the desk with the valuation figures she had prepared, and she watched Morrison's eyes move to her every few minutes with an expression of mild bewilderment, the kind men wore when they encountered a woman in a professional context and could not quite place where to file the information. "Your accountant," Morrison said at one point, nodding toward her. "My bookkeeper and accounts manager," Grant said. "She knows the numbers better than I do." "A woman," Morrison said, with the particular tone of a man who is not quite complaining but wants to register that he has noticed something. "A very good one," Grant said, with a finality that closed the subject. She caught his eye for just a moment across the room, and what passed between them in that glance was the shared private language of two people who have found they understand the world the same way. She looked back at her figures, and she was smiling at them without deciding to. The offer Morrison brought was not a good one, as she could have told him before he opened his mouth. She had spent 2 weeks researching the spring beef market, writing to contacts in Wichita and Abilene, and following the prices reported in the Kansas City papers that arrived by post. She had built a clear picture of what the Double T's spring cattle were worth and what a fair price looked like. When Grant told her what Morrison had offered, she looked at the number and said, 30% below what we should accept. I thought so, he said. If he's the best buyer you have access to, I can find others, she said. I have 3 names from the Abilene contacts. Can you write to them? He said, I already have, she said. He looked at her with that expression again, the one that she had come to understand as the particular way his face looked when she had done exactly what he would have hoped for before he had to ask for it. What would I do without you? He said. He meant it practically. She understood that, but the warmth of it was not entirely practical, and she let herself feel it without apology. February arrived with more snow and a letter from Pete Calloway, who had moved on to Colorado and written to ask if the position at the Double T had worked out. Minnie wrote back and said that it had, in several respects, and left the nature of several respects to his imagination. It was in February also that she had a more difficult moment than she had had in a while, a reminder that the world outside the Double T's fence lines was not operating under the same principles as the world within them. She had ridden into Caldwell for supplies, alone on Clover because the trip was routine and she knew the road well by now, and she had gone into the general store to collect the orders she had placed. The storekeeper, a man named Aldrich who had been unfailingly polite to her in all their previous dealings, had the orders ready and was civil enough, but when she handed him the ranch's business check, he held it for a moment and said, with a careful casual quality that made her skin prickle, You know I'll need Turner himself to confirm this since you're just the help. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. I am not the help, Mr. Aldrich, she said. I am the accounts manager of the Double T Ranch, and that check bears the authorized signature and is for a legitimate order. You have accepted authorized checks from this ranch for years. Those were from the foreman, he said. Or from Turner himself. The foreman does not manage accounts, she said. I do, and my authorization is on record with you in writing as I sent it over in September. She paused. If you would like to confirm that record, I am happy to wait. He found the record. He processed the transaction. He was not entirely gracious about it, but he did it. She rode back to the ranch with a tightness in her chest that she recognized as the specific kind of anger that comes from being required to prove yourself over and over to people who have decided not to see you. She was aware that this would not be the last time, that the world outside the Double T had not reorganized itself to accommodate the reality that she existed and was competent, and was owed the same courtesy as anyone else doing her work. She was aware that Grant's fairness was not the world's fairness, that the country around her operated on different terms. She was putting Clover away in the stable when Grant found her. She did not say anything about the encounter at the store, because she had not decided yet how much of it she wanted to share. But he had a way of reading her silences that she was still not entirely accustomed to. He leaned against the stable door and said, What happened in town? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll write Aldrich a formal letter confirming your authority. I sent him one in September, she said. I'll write him another one, Grant said, and I'll speak to him when I'm in town next week. Not to fight your battles because I don't think you need me to, but to make very clear what your position is here. She set down the curry comb and turned to look at him. The frustration in her chest was still there, but there was something else now too, the particular warmth of knowing that she was not alone in the thing, that there was someone who would stand at her shoulder even when she didn't ask him to. You don't have to, she said. I know, he said. I want to. She held his gaze. The stable was warm and smelled of hay and horse, and the last of the afternoon light was coming through the gaps in the boards in long, thin lines, and she thought that she loved this man with a directness and a certainty that was entirely characteristic of how she felt about things she had examined carefully and found to be true. Grant, she said. Yes. She crossed the short distance between them and took his face in her hands, which startled him. She could see that, and then she kissed him. It was not tentative. She was not a tentative person. It was a full, warm, certain kiss, the kind that says something clearly without any ambiguity about what it means. When they stepped back from each other, his hands were at her waist and his expression was one she had not seen before, open and undone and purely happy. "All right," he said, somewhat breathlessly. "I thought it was time," she said. "Yes," he said, "I think it was." Ruth, passing by the open stable door with a basket of linens, made a small sound that was probably meant to be inaudible and was not even slightly. Neither of them mentioned it. Spring came to the Kansas plains the way it always does, gradually and then all at once, the brown grass greening up from underneath, the sky lifting higher, the smell of the earth changing from cold stone to something alive. The cattle grew restless with the warmth and the new grass, and the ranch grew busy in the particular way of spring, busy with promise and preparation, the accounting work expanding to cover the new season's contracts and the spring tally and the market projections Minnie had been building through the winter. The 3 buyers she had contacted in Abilene and Wichita came through with offers in April that were substantially better than what Morrison had offered, and she negotiated the final contracts with a focused precision that left Grant watching from the doorway of the office with an expression she had begun to recognize as simply pride, uncomplicated pride in her that he did not try to hide or diminish. "You enjoyed that," he said, when she had sealed the last letter. "I enjoy being good at my work," she said. "I enjoy watching you be good at your work," he said. She looked up at him. They had been keeping company in the way that the ranch and the work and the world they lived in allowed, which meant evenings together and Sunday walks and a closeness that was understood by everyone on the property. And she had been thinking about the future in a way she had not allowed herself to think about it before, carefully and practically, but also with a warmth that practical thinking alone could not account for. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. He came in and sat down across from her, and she liked that about him too, that he sat down when she said she wanted to talk, that he did not hover or look impatient. "I am not a person who does things halfway," she said. "You know that." "I do," he said. "I am also not a person who makes decisions based on feelings alone, regardless of how strong those feelings are," she said. "I need things to make sense to me, practical sense." "That seems reasonable," he said. "So when I tell you that I think I would like this to be permanent," she said, "I want you to understand that I have thought about it practically and it makes sense. The work is here. The life I want is here." She paused, looked at him directly. "You are here." He was looking at her with those steady brown eyes that she had understood the quality of from very nearly the first moment she had seen them, and he said, "Are you asking me to marry you, Minnie Winslow?" "I am asking you whether you intend to ask me," she said. He stood up from the chair and came around the desk, and she stood too, and he took her hands in both of his and said, without any preamble, without any elaborate construction, "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. He put his forehead against hers for a moment, their hands still clasped, and the room was quiet around them, warm with the spring afternoon coming through the windows, the sound of the ranch outside carrying on in its ordinary purposeful way. "Good," he said quietly. "Yes," she said again, meaning it in every way it could be meant. They were married in late May of 1883 in Caldwell, at the small Presbyterian church on the main street, with Ruth and Thomas Briggs and several of the hands in attendance. The minister was a young man named Alcott who conducted the ceremony with sincere feeling and considerable brevity, which Minnie appreciated. She wore a dark blue dress that she had ordered from Wichita and which fit her properly, not the elaborate construction of lace and hoops that fashion demanded, but a well-made, handsome dress that she felt like herself in. Grant looked at her when she came to stand beside him at the front of the church with an expression that she recognized now as the one he reserved for the things he loved most, the land after a good rain, a problem that had finally resolved itself cleanly. She looked back at him with what she hoped was somewhat more composure than she felt, and they said the words and it was done. Ruth cried, which she denied afterward with considerable vehemence. They celebrated back at the ranch with a meal that Ruth had been planning for 2 weeks, and there was fiddle music from a hand named McCarthy who turned out to have genuine talent. And the evening was warm and long and lit by lanterns hung in the yard, and Minnie stood beside her husband in the lit yard under the enormous Kansas sky, and felt the kind of happiness that has honest roots in honest work and honest love, the kind that doesn't need to explain itself. That summer was the best summer the Double T had seen in years, or so Ruth said, and Ruth was the one who kept track of such things. The spring cattle contracts delivered at better prices than they had seen in 3 years. Minnie had reorganized the supply chain so efficiently that the quarterly costs were down significantly from the previous year. The South Pasture expansion that Grant had been considering for 2 years was finally undertaken, with Minnie's financial planning making clear that the timing was right. They worked side by side in the way that 2 people work when they have figured out the rhythm of each other. Grant managed the land and the cattle and the hands with the confident ease of a man who had spent a decade building his understanding of those things. Minnie managed the money and the records and the contracts and the supply chains with the precise attention of someone who saw the world in numbers and had learned to love what she could see clearly. Together, they built something that was more than the sum of either of them, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about any partnership. In the evenings they sat on the porch in the warm summer dark, listening to the sounds of the plains, and she would sometimes read aloud to him from the Kansas City paper that came 3 times a week by post, and he would sometimes tell her things about the ranch that he had noticed during the day, small things, the way a particular cow was behaving or the direction the weather was coming from, and she listened to the small things the way she listened to everything, with full attention. Because she had learned that small things were where most of the truth lived. One evening in July he said, quietly and without building up to it, "I think this is the happiest I have been." She set down the paper and looked at him. The porch was in shadow and the yard was lit by the late sun at a low angle and everything was gold and warm. "I think so too," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that in the summer evening, comfortable in the way that people who have found each other genuinely are comfortable, without the performing of it. In the fall of 1883, Minnie discovered she was expecting a child. She told Grant on a Thursday morning while he was having his coffee, because she was not the kind of person who built elaborate revelations around things, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that started at surprise and arrived at a deep, uncomplicated joy. "When?" he said. "March, I expect," she said. "I'll write to the doctor in Caldwell this week." He stood up and came to her and put his hands on her face, the way she had put her hands on his face in the stable the previous winter, and kissed her with a warmth that said everything about what he felt without needing to name it. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I intend to keep working." "I know you do," he said, smiling. "Good," she said. Ruth, when told, was triumphant in a way that was entirely in character, and made a pronouncement about what she was going to teach the child to cook before it could walk that kept Minnie smiling for the rest of the day. The winter of 1883 to 1884 passed with the particular quality of a winter you are genuinely glad to be inside for. The accounts were in the best order they had ever been. The ranch was, by the measures that mattered, flourishing. Minnie worked through the cold months with the efficiency that had become her trademark, adjusting her pace only slightly as March approached, and she drafted a system for the quarterly records that would allow the work to continue smoothly in the weeks immediately after the birth. Grant hovered in a way that was touching and occasionally excessive, and she told him so with enough honesty that he laughed and backed off slightly, but only slightly. Their son was born on the 15th of March, 1884, attended by the doctor from Caldwell and Ruth, who had apparently been waiting for this moment for some time and took charge of it with quiet authority. He was a large, healthy boy with dark hair, and Grant said, his mother's eyes, and the truth of that was visible from the first day. They named him Thomas James Turner, Thomas for the foreman who had served the ranch faithfully and James for Minnie's father, the school teacher from Missouri who had taught her that a woman who could not manage money was a woman who would always be dependent on someone else. Grant held his son for the first time with the particular careful wonder of a man who has worked with his hands all his life, and is suddenly holding something that requires an entirely different kind of care. He looked at the baby and then at Minnie, and the expression on his face was not something she could describe in any of the usual terms. "Hello," he said quietly to his son. "He can't understand you yet," she said. "I know," he said, "but it seemed rude not to introduce myself." She laughed, and the laugh made the baby startle slightly and then settle, and the room was full of the ordinary, extraordinary light of early spring coming through the windows. And Minnie thought that this was the thing that all the work had been building toward, not as an end but as a beginning, the particular rightness of a life that had found its proper shape. Thomas was a vigorous, curious child from the start, which Ruth attributed to good genes and good feeding in roughly equal measure. He grew through the spring and summer in the relentless way of healthy children, demanding and delightful, and completely unconscious of his effect on the people around him. Grant was a father the same way he was everything else, present and attentive and not performing anything, just genuinely engaged, and watching him with the baby in the evenings after the work was done was a thing Minnie stored carefully in some part of herself that she kept for the things that mattered most. The work continued, because the work was part of who they both were, and the double T continued to grow. By the fall of 1884, they had expanded the herd to 600 head, the South pasture improvement had been completed, and Minnie had negotiated a supply contract with a new vendor in Kansas City that reduced their annual costs by enough to fund the new equipment they had been needing for the barn. There were still moments of the world being what it was. A new banker in Caldwell who questioned her signature on the ranch's documents until Grant appeared and confirmed it, at which point the banker became immediately and entirely cooperative. A cattle buyer from St. Louis who addressed all his questions about the financials to Grant during a meeting, despite the fact that Grant had explicitly introduced her as the person who handled them, at which point Minnie had simply answered the questions herself, precisely and completely, until the buyer gave up trying to root around her. These things happened and she dealt with them, and they did not stop happening, and she did not stop dealing with them, because that was the nature of the time she lived in, and she had never expected the world to be easy. But inside the double T, and inside the life she had built with Grant, things were what she had decided they would be. In the spring of 1886, their daughter was born, a girl they named Clara Ruth, the Ruth being entirely Ruth's own reaction to hearing the name, which involved the kind of emotion that Ruth immediately claimed was something in her eye. Clara was smaller than Thomas had been and louder about it, with auburn hair that was unmistakably her mother's and her father's steady brown eyes, and Thomas, who was 2, regarded her with the solemn assessment of a small person encountering something unexpected and not yet sure what to make of it. He came around to her within a week, which was perhaps the fastest peace settlement in the history of the double T. Grant held Clara on the porch in the early evening when she was 3 weeks old, the spring air warm and full of the smell of new grass, while Minnie sat beside him with Thomas asleep against her side. The plain stretched out beyond the fence line in every direction, enormous and enduring, the same land that his father had left him and that he had rebuilt and that they had built further together. "Look at this," he said quietly, meaning everything, the land and the children and the life. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. Thomas was breathing the slow, deep breath of toddler sleep against her shoulder, and Clara was quiet in his arms, and the evening was perfect in the specific way that real evenings are perfect, imperfectly, with the smell of the barn in it and the sound of the cattle in the distance and all the everyday truth of a working life. "Minnie," he said. "Grant," she said. "I want to tell you something." "You can," she said. "When I came home that October and found you arguing with Dale Hutchins," he said, "and I asked whose side you were on and you said your own," he paused. "I think I knew then. I didn't have words for it yet, but I think I knew." She looked at him steadily, the way she had always looked at him. "I didn't know yet," she said honestly, "but I knew you were different. I knew you listened." "I listened because what you were saying was worth listening to," he said. "That is the most sensible compliment anyone has ever given me," she said. He smiled, and it was the same smile she had first seen on the day she arrived, the small, genuine one that started at the corner of his mouth and reached his eyes, the one that had changed the whole geometry of his face in a way she had not forgotten in all the years since. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said, in the same direct and certain way she said everything she meant. Clara made a small sound. Thomas stirred slightly. The plains were enormous and golden in the last of the evening light, and the double T stood solid and permanent within them, built up from 80 head and a bad piece of land and 2 people who had found in each other the particular thing that makes a life make sense. The years continued to build the way good years do, each one adding something to the structure of the thing they had made together. The Double T grew in reputation along the southern Kansas cattle circuit as a well-run operation with honest accounts, reliable contracts, and fair dealing. Grant's name was known among buyers and sellers across 3 states as a man whose handshake meant what it said. Minnie's name was known among a smaller circle of ranch accountants and business managers as someone worth knowing, and she had in 1887 spent 2 days in Caldwell working with the wives of 2 smaller ranchers who were trying to understand their husbands' accounts, teaching them the principles of the work with the same precision her father had once taught her. And she had found in that teaching a particular satisfaction that was its own kind of reward. Thomas grew into a boy who loved the land the way his father did, trailing Grant around the ranch from the time he could walk steadily, asking questions with an intensity that made Grant laugh and Minnie take note. Because the questions were good ones, precise and curious, the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. She taught him numbers before he started at the school in Caldwell, and he took to them with the same ease he took to horses, naturally and without apparent effort, though she knew enough about learning to know that things that look effortless from the outside are almost never effortless from the inside. Clara was a different kind of child, more cautious and more observational, the kind of person who watched a situation for a long time before entering it, and then entered it with a confidence that surprised people who had not been watching the watching. She had her mother's precision and her father's patience in a combination that was entirely her own, and she was, at 4, already demonstrating opinions about how things ought to be done that were expressed with a directness that made Ruth nod with great satisfaction. "She's going to be trouble," Ruth said, watching Clara instruct Thomas on the correct way to stack firewood. "Good trouble," Minnie said. "The best kind," Ruth agreed. In the fall of 1887, Minnie received a letter from a woman in Wichita she had known briefly years before, a woman named Alina who had recently been widowed and was trying to understand the financial situation her husband had left behind. The letter was not asking for help directly. It was the kind of letter that circles its real subject carefully, written by someone who is not sure they have the right to ask for what they need. Minnie recognized the circling, because she had done it herself before she had learned that the only productive approach to a necessary thing was to state it plainly. She wrote back directly and said she was glad to help, and over the following weeks she exchanged letters with Alina, walking her through the principles of reading an account book, identifying the difference between debt and manageable debt, understanding what she owned and what she owed, and what she could reasonably do with the gap between them. Alina's letters grew more confident as the weeks went on, the circling giving way to direct questions, and then to a quality that Minnie recognized as competence finding its footing. She showed Grant Aleener's final letter, in which Aleener said she had spoken to the bank in Wichita and had negotiated a new arrangement on the property that secured her position for the next 3 years and that she was considering taking in a boarder to augment her income. "She did all that herself," Minnie said. "You helped her see how," Grant said. "I showed her the tools," Minnie said. "She used them." He looked at her. "You should keep doing that," he said. She looked back at him. "I intend to," she said. He nodded, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, because for him it was. By the spring of 1888, 5 years after Minnie had arrived at the Double T with a carpet bag and a stubborn mare and a letter promising honest work, the ranch was running at a scale and efficiency that made it one of the better operated spreads in southern Kansas. The records were immaculate. The contracts were fair and profitable. The herd was healthy and well managed. The hands were paid on time and treated decently, which meant the Double T attracted and kept good men in a labor market where that was not always a given. Thomas was 4 and Clara was 2, and the house that had once been a bachelor's ranch headquarters was now a home in the fullest sense of the word, full of the sounds and complications and warmth of a family that had built itself honestly. Ruth had turned the cookhouse into the center of the Double T's social life in the way that gifted cooks always do, and on Sunday evenings there was often a gathering at the big table, Hands and Foreman and family all together, eating well and talking about the week's work, and occasionally someone would get out McCarthy's fiddle, and there would be music in the warm room while the plains dark settled around the ranch. On one such evening, Minnie sat beside Grant at the big table with Thomas on her other side and Clara on his lap, and the room was full of voices, and the smell of Ruth's cooking, and the particular warmth of firelight. And she looked around the table at the people she had come to know and work alongside, and some of whom she had come to love in the steady, particular way you love people who show up every day and do what they say they will. Grant leaned close to her and said, quietly, under the noise of the room, "Are you happy, Minnie?" It was the kind of question she would once have deflected, because happiness was not something she had spent a great deal of her life thinking she was owed. But she did not deflect it now. She looked at him, at the familiar face that she had learned the way she had learned the ranch's accounts, thoroughly and with love, and she said, "Yes, completely." He put his arm around her shoulder, and she leaned against him slightly, just slightly, because she was who she was and public displays of sentiment were not her instinct. But the slight lean said what it needed to say, and he held her a little closer, and Clara patted his cheek with a small proprietary hand, and Thomas was asking the hand next to him something about horses with the focused seriousness of a 4-year-old who expects a real answer. Outside, the Kansas plains stretched out under the enormous western sky, the same sky that had been there before any of them arrived and would be there long after, wide and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things that do not need you are beautiful. The Double T's lanterns made a warm, small square of light against it. Inside, the life they had made together was everything they had worked for and everything they had chosen, built on the solid foundation of honest work and honest love, and it was real and good and theirs, in every sense of every one of those words. Minnie Winslow Turner, accounts manager of the Double T Ranch, wife, mother, and woman who had always known whose side she was on, looked out the window at the dark plains and the scatter of stars above them, and she felt the deep and uncomplicated satisfaction of a person who has done the thing they were meant to do and found the place they were meant to be. And the thing she was most proud of, she thought, was not the accounts, though they were excellent, and not the work, though she was genuinely good at it. It was the fact that she had never, not once, compromised the essential truth of who she was to get any of it. She had walked into the Double T on a Thursday afternoon in October with nothing but her skills and her stubbornness, and she had stood in the face of everything that tried to tell her she didn't belong, and she had held her ground on every piece of it, and in doing so, she had built a life that was entirely hers. She was on her own side, as she had always been, as she always would be, And it turned out that the right man, when you found him, was on that same side right alongside you. She turned back to the room, to the firelight and the voices and the family at the table, and Grant caught her eye across it, the small smile, the familiar one, and she smiled back at him with the full weight of everything they had made. And the evening continued, warm and real and complete, like a well-kept account that finally balances, like a long, hard road that has brought you, at last, exactly where you intended to go.